Basically, my father said into the microphone, smiling like he was about to deliver the funniest line of the night. Nadia's a janitor who crawls around in filth. The ballroom erupted. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did. Enough that I heard it bounce off the chandeliers above us and roll across 300 executives, investors, donors, spouses, and employees who had spent the evening treating my father like royalty. Charles Mercer stood in the center of the stage in a black tuxedo, one hand wrapped around a crystal glass. 30 years of Mercer Development Group. That was what the Platinum Gala was supposed to celebrate. He had spent the last 20 minutes thanking people who had helped build his company, praising executives, applauding investors, and talking about the importance of choosing work that left something behind. Then he got to his family. My son Daniel, he said proudly, has done very well for himself in finance. Applause. Daniel smiled from his table. Then Dad looked at me, and my daughter Nadia works at a rehabilitation center. A few people started clapping politely. Dad immediately lifted his hand. Oh, don't make it sound glamorous. The applause died. My stomach tightened. I knew that tone. I had heard it at family dinners, birthdays, holidays, and every time somebody asked him what I did. But never like this. Never through a microphone. Dad continued. She makes it sound very professional, of course. Senior rehabilitation, something or other. More laughter. I kept my eyes on him. He grinned wider. But basically, she's a janitor who crawls around in filth. This time the laugh was louder. Dad wasn't finished. She spends her days cleaning up after people who can't take care of themselves. A man at the next table chuckled into his wine. A woman beside him smiled, then glanced at me and quickly looked away. Two executives I had spoken with during cocktails exchanged an awkward look. 10 minutes earlier, one of them had asked what field I worked in. Now I could almost see my father's description replacing whatever answer I might have given. That was the power he had in this room. Charles Mercer wasn't simply my father here. He was the founder, the chairman, the man whose name was printed across the backdrop behind the stage. If he told 300 people I was a joke, most of them would assume they were supposed to laugh. Dad lifted his glass to family. A few people echoed him. I did. Instead, I looked toward the table closest to the stage. Thomas Bell sat there, Dad's longtime business partner, Mercer Development Group's co-founder, the second largest shareholder in the company, and one of the most important men in the ballroom. Thomas wasn't laughing. He slowly put his glass down. Our eyes met. 3 weeks earlier, I had received a message from him asking me to attend this gala, not as Charles Mercer's daughter, for another reason entirely. He had asked me to keep one announcement confidential until he was ready. Dad knew nothing about that. As far as he was concerned, I was here because he had called me 2 weeks earlier and said this is the biggest night of my career. I expect my entire family to show up. Now he turned toward the giant screen behind him. Speaking of important things, he said, we have one major announcement tonight that I think everyone in this room will appreciate. My pulse changed. There it was. I looked at Thomas again. He gave me the smallest nod. Dad had no idea what was coming, and suddenly I understood something. If I stayed in my chair, the last thing 300 people would hear about me before that announcement was that I crawled around in filth for a living. I pushed my chair back. Daniel looked over. Nadia. I stood. Dad was still speaking. As many of you know, this company has always believed. I started toward the stage. Heads turned. Dad noticed me halfway there. His smile barely moved. Nadia, he said quietly when I reached the steps. Go sit down. I climbed the first step. His jaw tightened. Don't make a scene. I'm not planning to. I reached for the microphone. Dad pulled it slightly away. What are you doing? I'd like to answer your introduction. Not now. Actually, now seems appropriate. His smile remained fixed for the audience, but his eyes hardened. Nadia. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Dad looked past me. Thomas Bell had stood up. The room went noticeably quieter. Thomas said nothing. He simply looked at my father. Dad hesitated. Then he released the microphone. I turned toward the ballroom. 300 faces stared back at me. The laughter was gone. I could hear the faint hum of the speakers. Dad stood beside me, still wearing the expression of a man convinced this situation belonged to him. I looked directly at him. Dad, before you continue with tonight's biggest announcement, are you absolutely sure you know what I do for a living? A few people shifted in their seats. Dad gave a short smirk. Nadia, this really isn't. I looked toward Thomas. He was still standing. And for the first time that evening, my father seemed to realize that the second most powerful man in his company wasn't watching him. He was watching me. So why had Thomas Bell just stood up for the daughter Charles Mercer, considered nothing more than a janitor? 3 months earlier, I was on my knees beside a hospital-style bed at Harbour Ridge, tightening a transfer belt around a patient's waist. Don't pull me up, Mr. Lawson said. I'm not going to. He looked suspicious. You did yesterday. I helped you yesterday. Today you're doing more of it yourself. He gave me a look that said he hated that answer. Behind me, our occupational therapist adjusted the walker, while a nurse checked the positioning of the wheelchair. Mr. Lawson had spent 7 weeks recovering from multiple injuries after a construction accident. He could stand, but not reliably. He could walk a few steps, but turning too quickly still made him lose balance. His wife stood near the door holding a notebook. I pointed to the edge of the bed. Feet underneath you. He shifted them. Lean forward. I know. Then show me. He muttered something under his breath and pushed himself upright. His legs shook. I kept one hand close enough to catch him without taking over. He stood. His wife covered her mouth. Mr. Lawson looked at her. Don't start crying. I'm not. You are. I'm absolutely not. He laughed. That tiny laugh mattered almost as much as the standing. Once he was stable, I stepped back. Good. Now turn toward the walker. He did it slowly. By the end of that session, we had reviewed how he would get in and out of his own bed, how his wife should assist without pulling on his injured shoulder, and what modifications they needed before he could safely go home. That was my job. Not glamorous, not clean all the time either. I had been vomited on. I had cleaned bodily fluids off equipment. I had crawled underneath tables to check wheelchair clearance and knelt on bathroom floors to measure whether someone could transfer safely beside a toilet. But those moments were pieces of something larger. People arrived at Harbour Ridge after accidents, strokes, surgeries, and illnesses that had taken ordinary life away from them. My job was to help them get as much of it back as possible. By 32, I had become a senior rehabilitation specialist and program director. My father still described it as helping people go to the bathroom. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. Dad was already at the table when I arrived. My older brother Daniel was talking about a deal his firm had just closed. 7 figures in fees, Dad said, impressed. Daniel shrugged. It was a good quarter. Dad lifted his glass. That's what I like to hear. Then he looked at me. And you? I served myself vegetables. What about me? Any career news? I have career news every day. Dad smiled. You know what I mean. No, actually. He leaned back. Have you considered moving into something more serious? Daniel stopped eating. My mother looked down at her plate. I set the serving spoon down. I run a rehabilitation program. I know. Then what exactly is unserious about that? Dad sighed as though I had forced him into an exhausting conversation. Nadia, you're intelligent. You have a graduate degree. You could be managing something substantial. I am. In healthcare? Yes. He shook his head. You're still lifting strangers and wiping floors. Daniel glanced at him. Dad, what? I looked directly at my father. You've never actually asked what I do. He gave me a dismissive little wave. I know enough. That sentence landed harder than the insult, because he meant it. Not that he had misunderstood me, that he had decided understanding me wasn't necessary. I put my fork down. Come to Harbour Ridge. Dad blinked. What? Visit for one afternoon. Nadia, you think you know what I do? Come watch, he laughed once. I don't have time to tour rehabilitation centers. You have time for 3 golf tournaments this month. That's business. And my work isn't, he rubbed his forehead. We're preparing for the company's anniversary year. I have investors flying in, foundation meetings, planning committees. Exactly. What does that mean? It means you can always find time for things you respect. His face hardened. My mother finally said, Nadia, maybe this isn't the night. I stood. No, it's fine. Dad looked irritated now. There's no reason to become insecure just because your brother chose a more conventional path. I pushed my chair in. I'm not insecure about my job. Then stop acting defensive. I'm defensive because you insult it every time someone asks. He opened his mouth. I stopped him. I'm done explaining it to someone who has deliberately decided not to understand. Then I picked up my bag and left. 3 days later, Harbour Ridge's executive director called me into her office. When I arrived, our medical director was already there. The door closed behind me. We have a new admission coming in tomorrow, the executive director said. High profile. I sat down. How high profile? Enough that privacy is going to be unusually strict. She slid a file toward me. The patient had suffered serious orthopedic injuries in a vehicle accident followed by complications that prolonged his hospitalization. He needed coordinated mobility rehabilitation, occupational therapy, endurance work, and a detailed plan before returning home. You'll lead the program, she said. I opened the file. Then I stopped. Thomas Bell, my father's business partner, the man whose name had appeared beside Charles Mercer's on company documents since before I was born. Does my father know he's coming here? The medical director shook his head. That isn't our concern. Of course it wasn't. Thomas's medical information was private. Whatever relationship he had with my father didn't change that. The next morning, I walked into the consultation room. Thomas sat in a wheelchair near the window. He looked thinner than the man I remembered from company holiday parties. One leg was supported. His hands rested tightly on the armrests. He stared at me for several seconds. Nadia Mercer, Mr. Bell. He gave a tired smile. Thomas is fine. I sat across from him. Before we start, I want to be clear about privacy. Nothing about your treatment leaves this team without your authorization. His expression changed slightly. Including your father? Including my father. Thomas nodded. Good. He looked toward the door. I'm not ready for people at the company to know how limited I still am. That's your decision. He studied me. And you're really running this? I'm coordinating your rehabilitation plan. He looked almost amused. Charles never mentioned that. I didn't answer. Over the next hour, we reviewed what he could and could not do independently. He hated every answer that sounded like dependence. Could he transfer safely without assistance? Not yet. Could he climb stairs? No. Could he shower alone? Not safely. Could he stand from the wheelchair without help? He insisted he could. Show me, I said. Thomas gripped the armrests. He leaned forward. His arms trembled. He pushed. For a second, he rose several inches. Then his legs failed him. I stepped in and guided him safely back down. His jaw clenched. I had it. You almost had it. I don't want almost. I know. I crouched beside the chair and checked the position of his feet. Move this one back slightly. Thomas looked down at me. There I was, on the floor, exactly where my father always imagined me, except I wasn't scrubbing anything. I was calculating leverage, balance, strength, and how much assistance Thomas needed before we could safely progress him. He watched me adjust his positioning. Then he said quietly, your father has absolutely no idea what you do, does he? My hands stopped for half a second. I looked up. Thomas already knew the answer. Thomas hated the parallel bars. I ran half marathons, he said one morning, gripping both rails. Now everyone celebrates because I can stand for 40 seconds. 43 yesterday, I said. He looked at me. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you try for 44. Our physical therapist laughed from behind him. Thomas didn't, but he stayed on his feet for 51 seconds. That was how the next several months went. Progress came in measurements that would have sounded insignificant to anyone who had never lost the ability to do ordinary things. Standing safely, moving from a wheelchair to a bed without someone lifting him, crossing a room with assistance, turning without losing his balance, getting dressed without exhausting himself. Navigating the practice stairs at Harbour Ridge, we had a multidisciplinary team working with him, physical therapists, occupational therapists, nurses, physicians, and support staff. My job was to make sure those pieces worked together. One afternoon, Thomas reached the top of the practice staircase and stared down at me. 6. I have 14 at home. Then we have 8 more reasons to keep working. He smiled. You're relentless. You told me you wanted more than almost. He remembered saying it, so I did. Weeks later, during a progress meeting, Thomas walked into the conference room using a walker. Nobody applauded. He had made it clear early on that applause for every movement irritated him. But when he lowered himself into the chair without assistance, he looked at me. I nodded once. He nodded back. After the rest of the team left, Thomas remained seated. Nadia, can I ask you something? Of course. What happens to someone who needs this and can't afford months of it? I paused. That depends on what? Insurance, income, location, what services they qualify for, what support they have at home. And if insurance decides they've had enough rehabilitation, sometimes they go home before we think they've reached their full potential. Thomas looked toward the empty doorway. So medically stable can still mean unable to function independently. Absolutely. He was quiet. Then he said, I spent my career thinking healthcare ended when the hospital fixed whatever was broken. A lot of people do. I want to do something about that. I pulled my chair closer. What kind of something? I don't know yet. Something substantial. Thomas had a charitable foundation, but I wasn't interested in giving him a fundraising pitch, so I gave him facts. I explained where patients commonly fell through gaps, why extended rehabilitation could matter, and how transportation, home modifications, and limited coverage could interrupt progress. Thomas listened. He took notes. And when he left that afternoon, I assumed that was the end of the conversation. It wasn't. While Thomas was learning what rehabilitation actually involved, my father was becoming more comfortable mocking it. A month before the gala, Dad invited me to a private dinner with several Mercer Development executives and their spouses. One of the women seated across from me asked, Nadia, your father said you work in healthcare. What do you do? I opened my mouth. Dad answered first, rehabilitation. That must be rewarding. The kind where you need gloves, Dad said. 3 people laughed immediately. The woman's smile disappeared. I set down my water glass. I'm a senior rehabilitation specialist and program director at Harbour Ridge. Dad sighed. Nadia, I was joking. I know. Then smile. The table went quiet. I turned back to the woman. I coordinate rehabilitation programs for patients recovering from serious injuries and illnesses. We work on mobility, daily living skills, safe transitions home, and long-term independence. That sounds incredibly demanding, she said. It can be. Dad changed the subject. Later, he caught me near the restaurant entrance. What was that? I turned. What was what? You made that unnecessarily awkward. You described my career as something requiring gloves. It does require gloves. So does surgery. Dad exhaled sharply. Why do you insist on taking everything personally? Because you keep making it personal. I made a harmless joke. No, you made me the joke. He glanced toward the restaurant to make sure nobody was close enough to hear us. That defensiveness is exactly why people think you're insecure about your career. I stared at him. One day you're going to say that in front of someone who knows exactly what my work is worth. Dad adjusted his jacket. Then maybe they can explain it to me. He walked away. A few weeks later, Thomas returned to Mercer Development Group for limited executive duties. I didn't go. I couldn't. His treatment remained private, but I saw the company announcement. There was Thomas, standing with a cane beside my father. Dad had his arm around him. The caption praised Thomas's remarkable comeback. When I saw my father that weekend, he talked for 10 minutes about Thomas. Unbelievable recovery, he said. The man has always been tough. I waited. Dad never asked who had worked with him. Not once. Thomas noticed too. 2 days later, a formal invitation to Mercer Development Group's Platinum Anniversary Gala arrived at my apartment. Then I received a separate message from Thomas. He asked me to meet him privately at Harbour Ridge. When he arrived, he no longer brought the walker. He used a cane. I took our conversation seriously, he said. He placed a folder on my desk. I looked at it but didn't open it. What is this? Something my foundation has been developing. Thomas, I'm not asking you for an answer today. He rested one hand on his cane. But I am asking you to attend the gala. I was already ordered to attend. That made him laugh. I'm asking for a different reason. He tapped the folder. My foundation is making a major announcement that night. I looked at him. And you want me there? I need you there. He asked me to keep my involvement confidential until the announcement. I agreed. Days before the gala, the confidential proposal sat on my desk while I reviewed final program notes. My phone rang. Dad. I answered. Nadia. Hi, Dad. I just want to make sure we're clear about Saturday. About what? This gala is important. I'm aware. There will be investors, senior executives, donors, people flying in from all over, and... He hesitated. Please don't spend the evening talking about that rehab job. These are important people. I stared at the folder Thomas had left with me. For once, Dad's words didn't sting. They almost made me smile. Dad, I think you're about to discover they already know about it. The night of the gala, my father managed to insult my career before I had even taken off my coat. Nadia, I turned from the ballroom entrance. Dad was walking toward me in his tuxedo, already scanning the room as though every conversation belonged to him. You're at table 12, he said. Daniel's there too? Good evening to you too. He barely heard me. And please remember what I said? I handed my coat to the attendant. What exactly am I supposed to remember? His voice dropped. Don't turn every conversation into a lecture about rehab. I've never done that. I'm just trying to avoid awkwardness. For whom? Dad's attention shifted past me as another executive arrived. He smiled instantly. For everyone. Enjoy yourself. Then he walked away. I watched him shake hands with the executive like our conversation had never happened. What Dad didn't know was that I had spent the afternoon speaking with Thomas. The foundation board had voted. The initiative was approved. $12 million over 5 years. And Thomas had offered me the position of founding executive director. I had accepted. Dad thought I was attending as the daughter whose career he preferred not to discuss. Before the night ended, that was going to change. I entered the ballroom. Almost immediately, a woman from Thomas's foundation approached me. Nadia, congratulations. Thank you. We're excited to work with you. So am I. Dad was 20 feet away speaking with 2 investors. I saw him glance toward us. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Later, another person involved in the planning stopped me near the bar. Then another. Dad noticed each interaction. He never asked why. He simply seemed pleased that important people were being polite to his daughter. Then the room shifted. Thomas Bell had arrived. A cluster of executives moved toward the entrance. My father reached him first. Thomas, they shook hands. Dad immediately placed a hand on his shoulder and turned him towards several guests. Look at this man, Dad said. A few months ago, we weren't sure when we'd get him back. Now he's here. Thomas stood with a cane, not a wheelchair, not a walker, a cane. I remembered the first morning at Harbour Ridge when he couldn't stand from his chair without assistance. Dad had no idea what I was seeing when I looked at him. Remarkable recovery, Dad told the people around them. Thomas's eyes found mine across the room. He excused himself, then he walked toward me, slowly, carefully, but independently. Nadia, Thomas, he smiled. Big night. For both of us, apparently. For you more than you realize. Dad appeared beside him. There you are, he said to Thomas. Then he looked at me. I see you two know each other. Thomas and I exchanged a glance. You could say that, Thomas replied. Dad laughed. Well, Nadia grew up around the company. She knows everybody. Thomas opened his mouth. Dad touched his arm. Come on. There are some people from the Westbrook Fund who want to see you. Before Thomas could say anything else, Dad guided him away. Thomas looked back at me. I almost laughed. Even now, Dad couldn't imagine there might be something about my professional life he didn't know. 20 minutes later, Thomas found me again near the side of the ballroom. This time we were alone. It's official, he said. The board? Unanimous. My breath caught despite already knowing the vote was expected. 12 million? Over 5 years. Thomas nodded toward the ballroom. We start with extended rehabilitation access for patients whose coverage ends before their clinical team believes they're ready. Then transportation support and home transition assistance where possible. The exact gaps we had discussed at Harbour Ridge. And the position, I asked, yours if your answer is still yes. It is. He smiled. Good. I looked toward my father. When are you announcing it? After Charles finishes his anniversary speech. Thomas followed my gaze. He still doesn't know? Not about my involvement. Thomas shook his head. That is almost impressive. The lights dimmed. Dad took the stage. For the next several minutes, I listened to him talk about perseverance, leadership, service, the people whose work had made Mercer Development Group successful. Then he praised Thomas. He called his recovery an example of extraordinary determination. Thomas looked at me from his table, and then Dad started acknowledging his family. Daniel first, finance, success, applause. Then me. My daughter Nadia works at a rehabilitation center. A few people applauded. Dad lifted his hand. Don't make it sound glamorous. I felt Thomas go still. Dad smiled. Basically, she's a janitor who crawls around in filth. The laughter came. Then the second line. She spends her days cleaning up after people who can't take care of themselves. I looked at Thomas. His expression had hardened. He started to move. I shook my head. Not because I wanted him to stay silent forever, because I wasn't going to wait for someone powerful to defend me. Not this time. I stood, walked toward the stage. Dad saw me coming. Nadia, don't make a scene. I climbed the steps. I reached for the microphone. He pulled it away. Give me the mic, Dad. This is my gala. And that was my career you just introduced. Thomas stood. Dad saw him. His grip loosened. I took the microphone. The ballroom became silent. Dad, before you continue with tonight's biggest announcement, are you absolutely sure you know what I do for a living? He gave me that familiar smirk. Nadia, I think everyone understands it was a joke. No, I think everyone understands exactly what you believe. The smile faded slightly. I turned toward the audience. Rehabilitation professionals help people rebuild abilities that injury or illness has taken from them. We work on mobility, daily living skills, safe transfers, returning home. We coordinate with therapists, nurses, physicians, patients, and families. Dad shifted beside me. Yes, Nadia, very admirable. I crawl around on floors sometimes. A few people look down. I kneel beside wheelchairs. I measure bathrooms. I help people learn how to move safely when their bodies no longer work the way they used to. I turn back to him. You see something degrading in that because you've never bothered to understand why I'm doing it. Nadia, you might want to sit down, Dad, because the man whose recovery you've been celebrating all evening. A voice interrupted me. Nadia, I stopped. Thomas was walking toward the stage. The crowd parted for him. He climbed the steps carefully, cane in one hand. An event coordinator hurried forward with a second microphone. Thomas took it. Then he stood beside me and looked directly at my father. I think, he said, I should finish that sentence. Thomas stood beside me with one hand resting on his cane. My father stared at him. Thomas, you don't have to get involved in this. Thomas raised the microphone. I'm already involved, Charles. The room went completely silent. Thomas looked toward the audience. Several months ago, after my accident, I was admitted to Harbour Ridge Rehabilitation Centre. Dad's expression changed. Thomas continued. When I arrived, I couldn't safely get out of a wheelchair by myself. I couldn't climb the stairs in my own home. I needed assistance with basic tasks I had performed without thinking for most of my adult life. He paused. I found that humiliating. Nobody moved. But the people treating me never treated me as though I was humiliating. Thomas looked at me. Nadia Mercer was the senior rehabilitation specialist and program director responsible for designing and coordinating my rehabilitation plan. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Dad turned toward me. What? I held his gaze. Thomas continued before he could say anything else. Nadia did not work alone. I had physical therapists, occupational therapists, nurses, physicians, and support staff. It took an entire team. He tapped his cane lightly against the stage. But Nadia coordinated that team, worked directly with me, tracked my progress, helped prepare me for returning home, and made sure all those moving pieces were working toward the same goal. Dad's eyes dropped briefly to Thomas's cane. For months, he had praised Thomas's recovery. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to connect that recovery to the work he had just mocked. Thomas looked directly at him. You joke that your daughter crawls around on floors. Dad swallowed. I didn't mean. I remember her on the floor. That stopped him. The first day I met Nadia professionally, I tried to stand from my wheelchair. Thomas glanced at me. I failed. I remembered his hands gripping those armrests, the anger in his face when his legs refused to cooperate. She crouched beside me and repositioned my feet. She assessed what I could safely do and what I couldn't. She refused to let my impatience turn into another injury. Thomas looked back at Dad. When you saw your daughter crawling around on a floor, Charles, she wasn't beneath anyone. His voice remained calm. She was helping people learn how to stand again. Someone started applauding. Just one person at first, then another. Thomas lifted his hand. Give me another minute. The applause stopped. Dad looked like he wanted the stage to open beneath him. Thomas turned toward the large screen behind us. And that brings me to the announcement we planned for tonight. The screen changed. A new name appeared across it. Bell Rehabilitation Access Initiative. Dad stared at the words. Thomas addressed the room. My experience at Harbour Ridge showed me something I should have understood years ago. Surviving an injury and recovering from one are not the same thing. He explained that many patients left hospitals medically stable, but still faced months of work before they could function independently. Insurance limitations could end services before that recovery was complete. Transportation could become a barrier. Necessary home adaptations could be unaffordable. I had resources, Thomas said. I had access. Many people don't. He turned toward the screen. My foundation has committed $12 million over the next 5 years to expand access to rehabilitation services for patients whose financial circumstances or coverage would otherwise interrupt their recovery. This time, the applause was immediate. I heard chairs moving. Representatives from Harbour Ridge stood. Thomas waited until the room settled. The initiative grew from my own experience and from months of conversations with the person who made me understand where those gaps actually are. Dad was looking at me now. He knew. Thomas smiled. I'm pleased to announce that the founding executive director of the Bell Rehabilitation Access Initiative will be Nadia Mercer. The room erupted. For several seconds, I couldn't hear anything except applause. The same people who had laughed when Dad called me a janitor were now looking toward me. Some were clapping enthusiastically. Others looked uncomfortable. One man who had laughed into his wine earlier wasn't clapping at all. He was staring at the table. I didn't need his embarrassment. I didn't need anyone in that room to feel punished. What mattered was the man standing beside me. My father. Dad looked from Thomas to me. 12 million. Thomas nodded. Over 5 years. And Nadia is running it. Nadia was approved by the foundation board before tonight. That detail mattered. Dad couldn't tell himself Thomas had offered me the position because of what had happened on stage. He couldn't tell anyone he had arranged it. He couldn't attach Mercer Development Group to my appointment and somehow make my success part of his. The decision had already been made. Dad leaned toward me. Nadia, I was joking. I looked at him. A joke works because everyone understands what you really think. His face tightened. I understood. I didn't know about Thomas. That's not the point. But if I had known, that's exactly the point. He stopped. I lowered my voice. If you had known I was helping Thomas Bell, suddenly my work would have mattered. Dad said nothing. I asked you to visit Harbour Ridge. His eyes moved away. You said you were busy. Nadia. You told me you knew enough. His expression shifted. He remembered I had carried that sentence for months. Now I gave it back. That was the problem. You never knew enough. You just decided I wasn't worth asking. Dad looked toward the audience. For once, there was no joke waiting to save him. Thomas stepped forward again. There's one more thing I want to clarify. Dad turned. The Bell Rehabilitation Access Initiative will be administered independently through my foundation in partnership with Harbour Ridge. Dad frowned. I thought Mercer Development was participating in the announcement. You're hosting the announcement. Thomas kept his tone professional. But Mercer Development will not control the initiative, its funding decisions, or its leadership. Dad nodded slowly. I understood why that distinction mattered to him. He had expected the philanthropic announcement to become another prestigious moment in Mercer Development Group's anniversary celebration. Instead, he was standing beside an initiative he could neither control nor claim. Thomas turned back to the audience. Now I think Nadia deserves a proper introduction. He gestured toward me. Nadia Mercer, Rehabilitation Specialist, Program Director, and Founding Executive Director of the Bell Rehabilitation Access Initiative. People stood. Not everyone. Enough. I saw members of the Harbour Ridge team applauding, executives, donors, people from Thomas's foundation, and eventually Dad. He didn't smile. He simply clapped. The strange thing was that seeing him do it didn't feel the way I had imagined. For years, I thought his approval would settle something inside me. Standing there, I realized it no longer had to. After the presentation, several guests approached me. The woman from the pre-gala dinner hugged me. I knew there was more to what you did. Thank you. One of the men who had laughed during Dad's introduction waited until she walked away. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. I laughed. You thought it was a family joke. I still shouldn't have. I nodded. I appreciate you saying that. There were others. Some apologies felt sincere. Some sounded like people trying to distance themselves from an embarrassing moment. I didn't need to decide which was which. Then Dad appeared beside me. Can we talk? I looked toward Thomas. He gave me a small nod. Dad and I stepped into a quiet corridor outside the ballroom. For several seconds, he said nothing. That alone was unusual. Then he loosened his bow tie. I've spent 30 years building that company. I know. I suppose somewhere along the way, I started thinking that was the measurement of what? Success. He looked through the open ballroom doors toward Thomas. When Thomas came back to the office with back cane, I kept telling everyone what a remarkable recovery he'd made. He shook his head. I never once asked him who helped him get there. No. And I never asked you either. No. He rubbed a hand across his forehead. I'm sorry. I didn't rescue him from the silence afterward. Eventually he said, I mean it. I believe you. His shoulders relaxed slightly, but believing you're sorry doesn't erase it. They tightened again. Nadia, this wasn't one bad joke. I know you've been doing this for years, he nodded. I know. If Thomas hadn't been my patient, would you have apologized tonight? Dad opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That was answer enough. I don't want you respecting my career because Thomas Bell told you to. I understand. I need you to actually understand this part. I stepped closer. If we're going to have a relationship, you have to learn to respect me when there isn't a billionaire standing beside me explaining why I'm valuable. Dad looked down. Then he nodded. Can I visit Harbour Ridge? I studied him. Yes, but not for a photo. I wasn't, not for the company, not for publicity. If you come to learn. He nodded. Okay, we returned to the ballroom separately. Thomas was waiting near the stage. When I walked in, he smiled and raised his glass. I raised mine back. My father remained several steps behind me. For once, he didn't introduce me to anyone. He didn't explain me. He didn't correct my title. He let me speak for myself. Months later, the first patients entered programs funded through the Bell Rehabilitation Access Initiative. I divided my time between Harbour Ridge and building the initiative. We helped extend rehabilitation services for patients who otherwise would have lost access before they were ready. My relationship with Dad didn't suddenly become perfect. An apology wasn't enough for that. But one afternoon, he came to Harbour Ridge, alone, no photographer, no company communications director, no expensive donation check designed for a press release, just Dad. I walked him through the facility. He watched a physical therapist help a patient practice standing. He watched an occupational therapist demonstrate how someone with limited hand function could prepare a simple meal. He saw a nurse working through medication routines with a family. Then we passed one of our training bathrooms. A rehabilitation specialist was kneeling beside a patient, checking the position of a transfer bench. Dad stopped. Months earlier, that image would have been enough for a joke. This time, he watched. What is she checking? He asked. Whether he can transfer safely when he goes home. Dad nodded. He didn't say anything clever. He just kept watching. That didn't erase what happened at the gala. It didn't erase the dinners before it. But it was the first time I saw my father look at my profession without deciding what it was before anyone could explain it. And by then, I no longer needed him to understand it for me to know what it was worth. I had stopped shrinking my career to make him comfortable, stopped measuring myself against Daniel's salary or Dad's definition of prestige, stopped waiting for Charles Mercer to certify that my work counted. Sometimes I still think about that ballroom, 300 people, my father's microphone in my hand, the laughter disappearing when I stood up. My father called me a janitor because he thought getting down on the floor meant I was beneath him. He finally learned what I had known my entire career. Sometimes the person kneeling beside you is the reason you get to stand back up.